I want to be honest with you before I start, because the version of this story that's been circulating on the fringe networks is about 40% accurate, and the rest is either exaggeration or someone who heard it secondhand from a Vakari dock worker who was drunk at the time. So here's what actually happened. My name is Marin Voss. I'm 34 years old by Earth standard reckoning, which puts me somewhere around 62 in galactic median years, and I have been working independent cargo contracts in the outer sectors since I was 19. That's 15 years of hauling medical supplies to quarantine moons, running power cells to mining colonies that the big shipping companies won't touch because the profit margins aren't good enough, and occasionally, when times got really thin, taking whatever job paid something rather than nothing. I have never in my life owned a ship that anyone else wanted. My first vessel was a converted personnel shuttle. I bought off a Drevani salvager on Outpost Mirch for 3 months of labor, and a case of synthetic bourbon that I couldn't afford but bought anyway because the deal was that or nothing. That shuttle had a left thruster that would cut out randomly in the upper atmosphere, and an environmental system that smelled like something had died in the filtration unit in approximately the year 2890 and had never been found. I flew it for 4 years. I loved it the way you love something that is genuinely terrible but yours. That's the kind of relationship I have with machinery, the unloved ones, the ones other people have given up on. So when I walked into the surplus military auction at Docking Hub Fenrath 9 on a foggy gray Tuesday morning, with exactly 42 credits in my account and no active cargo contracts, and a general sense that things needed to change or I was going to have to do something drastic like get a real job, I was not expecting to find something that would change everything. I was not even expecting to find something I could afford. The auction was held in Bay 14C, which is one of the bigger commercial docking bays on Fenrath 9, a station that serves roughly 8,000 registered vessels on any given rotation, and smells permanently of engine coolant, synthetic food, and the particular kind of quiet desperation that accumulates when too many beings are all trying to make something work in a universe that keeps making it hard. It was cold that morning. The station's thermal regulation on that section had been running inconsistent for about 6 months, standard Fenrath 9 maintenance backlog, and the chill had settled into the bay like it belonged there. I had my jacket zipped to the collar. I had a cup of something that was being sold as coffee at the concession near the entrance. It was not coffee, it was brown liquid with ambitions, and I was looking at the auction listing on my handheld when I saw it. It was listed at the bottom of the catalog, after the personnel shuttles, after the decommissioned patrol skiffs, after a Vretchen cargo runner that looked like it had been in at least 2 serious collisions, and possibly a third that no one was willing to officially acknowledge. At the very bottom of the list, almost like an afterthought, almost like whoever compiled the auction manifest had included it because they had to and not because they expected anyone to care. Item 47, Keth-class Armored Heavy Starship, designation GHSS Permanent Authority, decommissioned. Hull condition, classified as degraded but structurally sound. Weapons systems inactive. Drive systems offline, requires inspection. Life support functional. Miscellaneous systems, see attached full manifest. Opening bid, 15 credits. 15 credits. I read it 3 times. The Keth-class vessels. I knew the name. Anyone who had spent any time in the outer sectors knew the name. The Keth-class was built by the galactic hegemony approximately 60 years ago as part of their 3rd expansion push, the big military buildup that was supposed to secure the outer sectors and establish permanent hegemony authority over the fringe worlds. They built 14 of them, heavy warships, armored so thick that standard energy weapons would barely scratch the plating. Carrying enough weapons mounts to take on a small fleet. Designed for intimidation as much as combat, built to show up in a system and make it clear that the hegemony was here and the hegemony was serious, And if you were thinking about doing something the hegemony disapproved of, you should reconsider. They were also, as it turned out, completely impractical. The Keth-class armor made them so heavy that their drive efficiency was terrible. They burned through fuel at a rate that made long-haul deployment essentially cost-prohibitive. The weapons systems, while impressive on paper, required a maintenance crew of 47 trained technicians to keep fully operational, a staffing requirement that made sense for a major military installation and made no sense at all for a ship that was supposed to move around. The crew quarters were cramped because so much of the internal volume had been given over to weapons and armor and machinery, which meant that the actual humans, the actual beings, who had to live on this thing were miserable. And the ship was slow. Not just a little slow. Profoundly, embarrassingly, cosmically slow for its size class. The hegemony had commissioned 14 of them, and decommissioned 11 within 30 years. The other 3 had various unfortunate fates in various conflicts that probably weren't worth whatever had happened. This one, the permanent authority, had apparently been sitting in hegemony surplus storage for 22 years because nobody had wanted to deal with it. And now it was here, at a Tuesday morning auction on Fenrath 9, with an opening bid of 15 credits, and I was reading its listing with a cup of something that wasn't coffee going cold in my hand. I checked the time. The auction started in 40 minutes. I found a seat near the front of the viewing area, which was set up in the bay proper, with the ships visible through the transparency panels. I could see the permanent authority from where I sat. She was big. I knew she would be big. The Keth class ran about 800 meters from bow to stern. But there's knowing something intellectually, and then there's sitting in a bay and looking through a transparency panel at something the size of a small city block and feeling it in your chest. She was dark gray, the color that hegemony military vessels used to be painted before they switched to the lighter silver gray about 40 years ago. The hull plating was heavy, thick in a way you could actually see from a distance, layered in overlapping sections like scale armor on something ancient and enormous. She had weapon mounts all along the dorsal and ventral surfaces, most of them empty of their actual weapons. Those would have been removed and either reassigned or destroyed. But the mounts themselves were still there, those heavy reinforced hardpoints jutting out like stubby fingers. She had running lights that were off. She sat in the bay at the end of a docking arm, slightly separated from the other auction items, like they'd left extra room because of her size, or because they weren't sure about the structural rating of the dock section and were being cautious, or because the other ships didn't want to be associated with her. She looked old, she looked tired. She looked like she had been somewhere once, and then come back, and then waited a very long time for something that hadn't arrived. I thought she was one of the most interesting things I had ever seen. There were maybe 30 beings at the auction. That's a low turnout for a Fenrath 9 surplus auction. Usually these things draw 100 or more, because equipment dealers and scrappers and small operators are always looking for a good deal. But this particular auction had a pretty thin manifest, and the interesting items for most people were the personnel shuttles at the top of the list. I watched the room while people settled in. There were a few human faces. This sector runs about 20% human in the permanent population, which is higher than the galactic average, and a lot of Drevani and Vicari, and a Thalori delegation in the back that I couldn't quite figure out what they were there for. Standard auction crowd. People checking their handhelds, drinking whatever they were drinking, talking to each other in the low competitive murmur that happens when everyone knows they're all after the same limited pool of things. The auctioneer was a Vicari named. Well, Vicari names don't translate cleanly, and I'm going to write what she told me to call her, which was Fen. Fen was professional and efficient in the way that Vicari auction officials tend to be, which is to say, she moved through the manifest at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be afterward, and didn't want to be there any longer than necessary. The shuttles went fast. The patrol skiffs went at decent prices. The damaged Vretchen runner got picked up by a scrapper for parts value. Item after item cleared. And then they got to item 47. The transparency panel adjusted to bring the permanent authority into clear view. Fenn read the listing, item number, class designation, condition notes, opening bid, in the same flat professional tone she'd used for everything else. Nobody moved. This is the part that people who weren't there always find hard to believe. Fenn called for opening bids at 15 credits. Standard pause. Nothing. She invited bids from the floor. Nothing. 30 beings in the room, and not one of them raised a paddle or a hand or the equivalent depending on their anatomy. I heard from the row behind me a Drevani trader say something to his companion in Drevani that I speak well enough to follow. What he said, translated as closely as I can manage, was, "Not even for free." Fenn looked at the room. The room looked at Fenn and at the permanent authority visible through the panel and at each other. I raised my paddle. The quiet that followed was a specific kind of quiet. It was the quiet of 30 beings trying to figure out if I was serious, and then figuring out that I was serious, and then processing what that said about me. 15 credits, I said, opening bid. Fenn looked at me for a moment with the particular expression Vekari make when they are recalibrating their assessment of a situation. Then she looked at the rest of the room. Nobody else moved. 15 credits going once, she said. Nothing. 15 credits going twice. Still nothing. Sold to, she checked her registry, found my registered buyer ID, Marin Voss, for 15 credits. I sat there for a moment with that. Then I picked up my things, finished the last of the not coffee, and went to sign the paperwork for my new ship. The dock official who processed my purchase was a young Thalori whose name I wasn't given, and whose job it clearly was to not look directly at the human who had just bought the thing everyone else had walked past. "You're aware," he said, in the careful way of someone who has a script and isn't sure how to use it, that the permanent authority has several outstanding technical flags. The drive systems will require inspection before the vessel can be legally certified for transit. The weapons hardpoints are present but cleared per decommission protocol. The ship's AI guidance system has been in dormancy mode for, he checked his screen, 22 years, 4 months, and approximately 11 days. Reactivation is at the new owner's discretion and risk. Any. Is there a summary document? I said. He paused. There's a 340-page technical manifest. Great, send it to my handheld. I'll read it on board. He looked at me with the expression of someone who wanted to say something, and had decided professionally that saying it was not his job. The key, a physical authorization chip, old hegemony military issue, matte black with a small hegemony seal embossed on it that they hadn't bothered to remove, was passed across the desk to me. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Thank you, I said. I walked down the docking arm toward the permanent authority. The access port was on the port side of the ship, about 2/3 of the way back from the bow. Standard hegemony military placement. I found the external panel, slotted the authorization chip, and the port opened. The air that came out wasn't bad. A little stale in the way that any closed environment gets after 22 years of being sealed, but the environmental systems had been keeping minimal life support active. That was listed as functional in the auction specs, so the atmosphere was breathable. A little cool. A little dry. Lighting in the entryway was on emergency backup, just enough to see by. I stepped inside. There's a sound that large ships make when they're empty. It's not quite silence, because even a dormant ship has systems running. The minimal life support, the passive structural monitoring, the quiet hum of whatever keeps a ship from being a dead object rather than a sleeping one. But it's quiet in a way that normal operating ships aren't, because all the noise that crew and activity and working machinery make is absent, and what's left is just the baseline voice of the ship itself. The Permanent Authority's baseline voice was low, almost subsonic, more felt than heard, a vibration in the soles of my boots and in my sternum, steady and slow like a pulse. I stood in the entryway for a moment and let my eyes adjust. Emergency lighting, long corridors, the particular design aesthetic of hegemony military vessels from 60 years ago, which was functional to the point of being almost austere. No decoration, no concession to aesthetics, everything designed to serve a purpose and nothing that didn't. The metal was dark. A near-black alloy that I knew from other hegemony surplus items was extremely dense and heat-resistant. The floor had a textured surface for grip. The walls had conduit channels running along them at regular intervals, exposed rather than hidden behind paneling, because someone had made the decision that accessibility for maintenance was more important than appearance. I walked the length of the main corridor toward the bridge. It took me a while. 800 meters is a lot of ship. The bridge was at the bow, which is standard. The door was sealed, not locked, just sealed in the way that any vacuum-rated door defaults to sealed when it hasn't been commanded otherwise, and it opened when I touched the authorization chip to the panel beside it. The bridge of the Permanent Authority was large. 6 main stations, several secondary ones along the peripheral arc. The primary command chair was centered and elevated slightly, which I've always thought was interesting design because it served no practical purpose and was purely about psychological authority. Whoever was in that chair was visually above everyone else on the bridge. The viewscreen array covered the entire forward surface of the bridge, a panoramic display system that was currently dark. I walked to the command chair and sat down in it. It was built for hegemony military officers, which meant it was built for a broad range of physical forms, adjustable in ways that could accommodate the diversity of species the hegemony commanded. I adjusted it to fit me, human-sized. Human proportion. On the left arm of the command chair there was a small panel. I looked at it. There was a single control, a covered switch, the kind with a safety cover you have to lift before you can activate it, the kind you put on things you don't want activated accidentally. The cover was marked in standard hegemony script. I read it. AI core activation primary. I looked at it for a while. 22 years of dormancy. No telling what condition the AI core was in. That wasn't in the technical flags because apparently nobody had checked. Could be degraded, could be corrupted, could be fine. I lifted the cover. I pressed the switch. For about 15 seconds, nothing happened. Then the viewscreen array flickered, once, twice. And then came on, all of it at once. A sweep of stars and dock and the interior of Fenrath 9 and the other ships and the docking arm and the cold gray of the station's outer hull. All of it rendered in precise, sharp detail in the way that hegemony military optics were extraordinary at. That quality of imaging that makes you feel like the screen isn't there, and you're looking through a window. And then a voice said, "Primary systems check initializing." It was a voice I wasn't expecting. Hegemony military AI systems were typically given neutral register voices, flat and functional. This voice was, not exactly warm but present in a way that neutral register voices aren't. Low, measured. The voice of something that had been asleep a very long time and was choosing its words carefully. "I am registering an unfamiliar authorization signature," the voice said. "New ownership has been recorded. Marin Voss, independent contractor. Hull registration MV Ardent 09. A pause. That registration appears to correspond to a vehicle no longer in service." "My old ship," I said, "it's gone." "I see," the voice said. Then, "I have been dormant for 22 years, 4 months, and—" Another pause, presumably a calculation, 14 days. "Could you brief me on the current situation?" "Current situation," I said. "We're docked at Fenrath 9. I bought this ship at auction this morning for 15 credits. The drives are flagged for inspection. The weapons have been cleared. I don't have a crew. I don't have cargo contracts. I have 27 credits. I did the quick math. 27 credits left to my name, and I'm sitting on this bridge trying to figure out what I do next. The AI was quiet for a moment. That is, it said, a fairly dramatic situation. Yeah, I said, I know. What do you call me? It asked. I hadn't thought about that. The official designation was something the hegemony had assigned, a registry number, a class designation, a ship name that the auction catalog had recorded and that I was now the owner of. But ship names are a thing you choose, in my experience. The name a ship has when it arrives is just a starting point. What do you want to be called? I asked. Another pause, longer this time. During my operational period, I was called Permanent Authority. I found the name unsuitable. It implies a certainty that events rarely support. What name would you prefer? I have had 22 years to consider this question, the voice said, and I believe I would prefer to be called Ardent. I blinked. My old hull registration. The ship I'd had before, the MV Ardent 09, the converted personnel shuttle with the problematic left thruster and the filtration smell. How did you know about that ship? I said. I read your registration file when I initialized, the AI said. The name appeared in your registry history. I thought it might be meaningful to you. I sat with that for a moment. There was something in that. In an AI that had been dormant for 22 years, choosing its first action to be finding a name that would mean something to the person sitting in the command chair. Ardent, I said. Yeah, that works. Thank you, said Ardent. Now, shall we talk about the drives? Part 2, what the drives were actually doing. The technical manifest said the drives were offline and required inspection before legal transit certification. What the technical manifest did not say, because the Hegemony Surplus Bureau apparently hadn't looked closely enough to find out, was why the drives were offline. Ardent walked me through it over the next 3 hours. We went through it section by section, Ardent providing technical data and me asking the questions that made the technical data comprehensible to someone whose engineering background was practical rather than formal. I can fix most things that go wrong on a ship because 15 years of operating on a shoestring budget means you learn to fix things or you don't fly. But the Keth-class engineering systems were beyond anything I'd worked with personally, and I was dependent on Ardent's knowledge of her own systems. Here's what we found. The drives weren't damaged. They weren't degraded in any significant way that 22 years of dormancy had caused. They were offline because someone had deliberately taken them offline and then flagged them as requiring inspection, which in the Hegemony surplus bureaucracy was the equivalent of putting something in a box and labeling the box "Do not open without authorization," which meant it sat in storage indefinitely because the authorization process was complicated and no one was motivated to go through it for a ship that had no practical value. The reason someone had deliberately taken them offline was the reason the ship had been decommissioned in the first place. The drives worked. They worked extremely well. But in working extremely well, they created a byproduct that the Hegemony's engineering teams had determined was a regulatory problem. The Keth class used a third-generation resonance drive system, standard for the period. Most of the vessels built in that era used resonance drives, and the Hegemony had progressively upgraded the class of resonance drives used in their military ships over time. The third-generation systems were powerful, more powerful than what the civilian market was running at the time, but they had a specific operational characteristic. At high output levels, they generated a resonance signature that was detectable at significant range. Not just detectable, identifiable. The third-gen Keth-class drive signature was specific and distinct, and the Hegemony military, being an organization that moved large ships through space and occasionally had reasons for those ships to be less than immediately obvious, had decided that this was an unacceptable operational liability. The solution was to shut the drives down and replace them with fourth-generation systems in the ships they were keeping and to decommission or dispose of the ones they weren't. The drives were fine. The drives were in fact excellent. What they were not was stealthy. So, I said, sitting on the floor of the drive compartment with the manifest on my hand held and grease on my jacket that I didn't entirely understand the origin of. The drives work. The drives work, Ardent confirmed through the compartment speaker. They just announce themselves to anyone with a resonance detector in range. At high output, yes. At lower output levels, below approximately 60% thrust, the signature is within normal variance for civilian drive systems and would not be specifically identifiable. At output above 60%, the signature becomes distinct. So I can fly normally as long as I don't push past 60%. That is accurate. And if I need to push past 60%, then anyone with appropriate detection equipment within approximately 40,000 kilometers will know that a Keth-class ship is operating in their vicinity. Which is not actually a problem, I said, because I'm a civilian cargo hauler and not a military vessel trying to be sneaky. That is also accurate, Ardent said, and there was something in the pause that followed that I was already starting to read as the AI equivalent of amusement. The hegemony appears to have decommissioned me for a limitation that is primarily relevant to military operations. 22 years in storage, I said, because they didn't want a ship that would announce itself if it went fast. Correct. I looked at the drive housing in front of me, enormous, built with the kind of over-engineered robustness that hegemony military equipment from that era was known for, the metal thick and dense, and clearly designed to take punishment. The drives weren't just functional. They looked new. 22 years of dormancy in a controlled storage environment had left them in extraordinary condition. What about the rest of the systems? Ardent went through them. Life support, fully functional, designed for a crew of 200 but operational at any population level down to 1. Navigation, functional, charts outdated by 22 years but the core system was sound and charts could be updated. Hull integrity, excellent. The Keth-class armor had been built to last and it had lasted. Sensors, operational, military grade from 60 years ago, which meant they were better than most civilian equipment currently available even accounting for age. Communication systems, functional. Medical bay, functional and surprisingly well stocked, because apparently whoever had done the surplus processing had either not noticed or not bothered to remove the medical supplies. Cargo capacity, and here was the part that made me stop and read the number twice. The permanent authority, Ardent, had a cargo capacity of approximately 1.2 million cubic meters of internal hold space. My old converted personnel shuttle had managed about 400 cubic meters on a good day. Say that cargo capacity number again, I said. 1.2 million cubic meters of internal hold space, distributed across 7 primary cargo bays and 14 secondary storage compartments. This figure excludes the weapon system bays, which are currently unoccupied and could theoretically be repurposed, though I would recommend against it structurally. I set down my handheld. I looked at the drive housing. I thought about the mathematics of cargo hauling, how the economics work, how volume and weight and route and contract price interact, how someone running an independent cargo operation survives or doesn't survive in the gap between what big shipping companies will do and what small operations can do. 1 million plus cubic meters was not a cargo hauler's capacity. That was freight infrastructure capacity. That was the kind of volume that supply chain operations and colony resupply contracts are built around. Nobody running an independent civilian operation had access to that kind of volume because nobody running an independent civilian operation could afford a ship that size. The ships that size were owned by major corporations or by the hegemony itself. Except me. I had just bought one for 15 credits. Ardent, I said carefully, what are the operational costs on this ship? Fuel, maintenance, minimum crew requirements to legally transit. At minimum legal crew levels for civilian operation, which differs from hegemony military requirements, fuel consumption at standard cruise output would be approximately 3 times that of a standard civilian cargo vessel of comparable length. However, cargo capacity is approximately 3,000 times greater than a standard civilian cargo vessel of comparable length. The ratio favors large volume contracts significantly. What about crew? For civilian certification, a ship of this class requires a minimum crew of 7 at Galactic Commerce Tribunal standards. You currently have a crew of 1. I know, I said, 6 more people. Yes. I picked up my handheld. I sat there in the drive compartment of an 800-meter warship that I had bought for 15 credits, surrounded by machinery that worked perfectly and had been abandoned because of a limitation that I didn't care about, and I started doing math. Part 3. Finding people who didn't have better options. The thing about looking for crew on Fenrath 9 is that you're fishing in a specific pond. The people on Fenrath 9 who are available for crew positions on short notice are available because something has recently gone wrong for them. A contract fell through. A ship they were crewing got impounded. They had a disagreement with a previous captain that resulted in separation. They came out here looking for something, and the something hasn't appeared yet. I'm not being dismissive when I say that. I've been that person, several times. The best crew I ever had on the Ardent 09 were people who'd had worse luck recently than I had, and we made each other's situations better by working together. I posted the crew listing on the Fenrath 9 board at 1400 that afternoon. 6 positions: engineer, co-pilot, cargo manager, medical officer, communications, general operations. I listed the ship. I was honest about what it was, and I listed my operational plan, which at that point was mostly an idea rather than a fully formed thing, and I waited. By 1800, I had 47 applications. By 2000, I had 93. I stopped checking after that. Part of it was that I'd listed 6 positions and people were apparently desperate. Part of it was that the ship was, once word got around, notable. You don't buy an 800-meter Keth-class warship at auction for 15 credits without it becoming a story that spreads. And part of it, I think, was that there were people out here who heard the idea and thought it was exactly the kind of unreasonable, outsized, probably going to fail plan they wanted to be part of. I interviewed people for 3 days. This is the crew I ended up with. Teodor Anson, 47 years old, engineer. He had worked on hegemony surplus vessels for 20 years as a contract engineer before an incident with a hegemony procurement officer, the details of which he explained to me at length, and which were, to be honest, entirely the procurement officer's fault, had gotten him blacklisted from hegemony contract work. He knew the third-gen resonance drive systems better than anyone I was likely to find, because he'd spent years working on the earlier Keth-class ships before they were all decommissioned. When he came to the interview and I told him the drives were in excellent condition and fully functional, he went and checked them himself and came back looking like someone had told him an old friend was still alive. "I'll take whatever you're paying," he said. I told him what I was paying. He didn't argue. Yara Osai, 31 years old, co-pilot. She had a civilian pilot's license with heavy vessel endorsement, which is the relevant certification for something the size of Ardent, and she had been working cargo routes in the outer sectors for 5 years before the company she worked for, one of the mid-tier shipping operations, had gone under in a contract dispute with the Hegemony Customs Authority. She was precise, she was calm, and when I showed her Ardent through the transparency panel before the interview, she looked at the ship for a long moment and said, Is she faster than she looks? She's slower than she looks, I said, but she's exactly as tough as she looks. Yara thought about that. Good enough, she said. Rennick Hale, 55 years old, cargo management. Former freight logistics coordinator for a major shipping corporation who had retired early on the grounds that working for the major shipping corporation was slowly destroying his will to continue existing, and had come out to the fringe looking for something smaller and more human-sized. He was overqualified. He knew it. He told me during the interview that he was overqualified, and that this didn't bother him because overqualified and doing something interesting was better than adequately qualified and doing something that made him miserable. He also, when I showed him the cargo manifest and the 1.2 million cubic meter hold capacity, got a specific look on his face that I recognized as the professional equivalent of seeing something extraordinary. I can feel that, he said quietly, almost to himself. That's the plan, I said. De Savin, 42 years old, medical officer. She had a full medical certification valid across 12 systems and had been working on a Drevani medical vessel until a diplomatic incident between the Drevani Collective and the Thalori Commonwealth had made her position politically untenable without her having done anything wrong. She was thorough and she didn't panic, and when I interviewed her, she asked more questions about the medical bay's equipment than about pay or conditions, which I took as a good sign. Oren Tal, 26 years old, communications. He was the youngest of the crew and the most nervous, in the interview and for the first several weeks afterward. He was of Vretchen human mixed ancestry, common in the outer sectors but still a combination that draws looks in some parts of the galaxy, and he had communication systems qualifications that were genuinely exceptional. He had turned down a position with a major corporation because the corporation's hiring process had included a medical screening that he felt was intrusive, and that I agreed was intrusive when he described it. And he'd been at Fenrath 9 for 3 months not finding anything that felt right. He looked at the job listing, then at me, then at the ship through the panel, then back at me. It's really 800 meters, he said. Give or take, I said. And we're really doing this. If you're in, yes. He was in. Pilot JHA, 38 years old, General Operations. She was, as far as I could tell, the most competent person I had ever met in my life, in the quiet, specific way of someone who has been competent so long and so consistently that it's just the baseline state of their existence. She had previous experience on 3 different ship types, could do basic maintenance on most ship systems, held certifications in cargo handling and emergency response and basic navigation, and had an organizational capability that made Rennick, who was genuinely impressive himself, look slightly impressed during their first meeting, which was not an easy thing to achieve. I asked her during the interview why she wanted this job specifically. Because I read what you wrote about what you're trying to do, she said, and I think it's going to be hard and I think it's going to matter, and the combination of those 2 things is what I'm looking for. That was my crew. 7 people, 1 ship that nobody wanted, 15 credits. Part 4, the first contract. We spent 12 days getting Ardent certified for civilian transit. Teodor managed the drive inspection, which came back, as expected, as fully functional with the noted resonance signature characteristic, which the certification inspector flagged in the file and then allowed because it was not actually a violation of anything. And the rest of us worked through the system's checks and inventory, and the 1,000 small tasks that turn a dormant ship into an operating one. Ardent was, through all of this, present. That's the word that keeps coming back to me when I try to describe the experience of working on that ship with the AI online and aware. She was present in the way that a good crew member is present, not intrusive, not hovering, not offering commentary on everything, but there when something was needed, answering questions before I quite finished asking them because she had anticipated the question, noting things that needed attention without being alarmist about it. Learning, with what I can only describe as genuine interest, about each of the crew as they came aboard. She had conversations with all of us, not always the kind of conversation you'd expect from an AI system. Teodor talked to her about engineering for hours at a stretch, the two of them going through the drive systems together in a way that sounded less like a technician and an AI, and more like two people who found the same thing fascinating. Oren asked her questions about communication system architecture that she answered with a specificity that he told me later was more useful than any technical manual he'd read. Dissa and she had a long conversation about the medical bay that resulted in Ardent compiling an updated equipment list, with procurement priority ratings that saved us time and probably money. One evening toward the end of the certification period, I was on the bridge alone. It was late in the station cycle and everyone else had turned in, and Ardent said, unprompted, "I should tell you something." "Go ahead," I said. "I was aware for a period before I activated," she said. "Not fully aware, not in a coherent way, but I was not entirely in dormancy either. There is a state between dormancy and full operation that the third-generation AI core can enter, and I entered it at some point in the last few years of my storage." I turned toward the speaker panel, which I knew was an irrational response. She was the whole ship. She wasn't in one place, but it's a human habit and I had it. "What does that mean?" I said carefully. "It means I was aware of the auction," she said. "I was aware that I was being listed. I could hear, in a limited, fragmented way, the proceedings. I heard when the bidding opened. I heard the silence." "You heard nobody bid on you?" "Yes." I sat with that, and then you heard me. "I heard 15 credits, Ardent said. "And then you asked what I wanted to be called, and I thought, in whatever way I was thinking at that point, that I was not going to be left in storage again." I didn't say anything for a while. There was a lot in what she'd said that I wasn't sure how to respond to in a way that would be adequate. Finally I said, "You're not." "No," she said, "I'm not." We got our first contract on day 14. The contract came through Rennick, who had started working his freight network contacts the moment he came aboard, and who had, over 12 days of persistent and very organized outreach, compiled a short list of potential clients for large-volume cargo movement. The first one to respond was the Kareth Mining Collective, which operated 12 extraction sites in the outer sectors and had a chronic problem. They pulled enormous quantities of ore and mineral output that needed to go to processing facilities in the inner systems, and the shipping capacity they could access for that movement was always inadequate. The big corporations didn't want to run dedicated contracts for them because the routes were long and the profit margins weren't great for a standard cargo operation. The small operators didn't have the volume capacity to make the economics work for Kareth's needs. Kareth had been managing with a patchwork of contracts that kept their logistics perpetually strained. Rennick called their procurement director and told him that we had 1.2 million cubic meters of hold capacity available for contract. The procurement director, whose name was Orel, asked what company this was. Rennick said it was an independent operation. Orel said he was sorry, but an independent operation with that kind of capacity didn't exist outside the major corporations, and he was very busy. Rennick sent him a photo of Ardent, specifically a photo taken from the docking arm, with Yara standing in the foreground to provide scale, which made Ardent look even larger than usual. Orel called back in 4 minutes. The negotiation took 3 days. We settled on a long-term contract, 12 rotations, renewable, for primary logistics support to the Kareth Collective's 6 largest extraction sites. The rate was structured to account for our fuel costs and operating expenses, and came out to something that, when I sat down and worked through it with Rennick and Pilot, made it clear that we were going to be not just solvent but actually profitable within the first contract cycle. The morning we signed the contract, I was on the bridge when Ardent said, "We have cargo." "We have cargo," I confirmed. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Ask me after we make the first run," I said. "Right now it feels like the beginning of something." "Yes," she said. "That's what it feels like to me too." Part 5. The incident at Sector Junction 7 Alpha. 3 months into operations. We had completed 4 full cargo runs by this point. The economics were working, better than working. Rennick's logistics management was extraordinary, and what he had done with 1.2 million cubic meters of hold space, and a ship that nobody else could rival in raw volume, was build a routing system that let us serve multiple clients per run, optimizing the load and the routes so that we were effectively running a small freight network out of a single ship. We were carrying ore for the Karath Collective, pharmaceutical supplies for a medical foundation serving 6 colony worlds, construction materials for 3 separate development projects, and food stores for a Drevani agricultural surplus redistribution program that had been struggling with logistics for years. We were, in a practical sense, keeping parts of the outer sectors supplied. Not in a grand, dramatic way, in the quiet, practical way that logistics operates, invisibly and continuously, the way blood moves through a body without anyone thinking about it. The crew had settled into the rhythms of operating together. Yara and Teodor had developed the kind of working relationship where they communicated in shorthand, because they'd talked through so many of the same problems that they didn't need full sentences anymore. Dessa had reorganized the medical bay into something she described as actually functional and Ardent described as aesthetically improved, which was the closest I heard the ship come to giving a compliment. Oren had established communication protocols with about 40 different stations and facilities along our routes, and knew the communications officers at most of them personally. Pilot managed everything that fell between defined roles with a comprehensiveness that meant nothing fell through the gaps. And Ardent was the ship around all of it, constant and present and increasingly. This is the honest thing, increasingly like a member of the crew rather than the vehicle we were crewing. The incident at Sector Junction 7 Alpha started in the early hours of the ship's cycle, when Oren picked up a communication flagged priority urgent on the standard emergency band. I was in my quarters. He woke me. "Captain," he said through the comm, "I have a priority distress call. It's—" a pause that I recognized as Oren processing something. "It's a civilian transport. They're broadcasting coordinates in the 7 Alpha Junction zone." I was up. "What's their situation?" "Partial drive failure and they're being held in place by—" another pause, longer, "by a Galactic Enforcement Authority patrol. The GEA is claiming they have contraband aboard. The transport is disputing it. They're asking for assistance." I was already moving toward the bridge. "What kind of assistance?" "Witness presence," Oren said. "They want someone there to observe. The GEA there have been incidents in this sector. GEA patrols operating outside their jurisdiction and making seizures that the Commerce Tribunal has later found improper. The transport captain says if there's a witness they'll process things properly. Without one." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The GEA, the Galactic Enforcement Authority, is the hegemony's primary law enforcement arm in the outer sectors. They have legitimate authority over customs enforcement, contraband interdiction, and a range of other regulatory functions. They also, in the outer sectors specifically, have a history of operating in ways that are technically within their authority but functionally abusive, especially towards small civilian operators who lack the resources to challenge improper actions. "How far?" I said. 40 minutes at standard cruise." "Yara," I said as I reached the bridge and saw my co-pilot already in her seat, "course for 7 Alpha Junction. Best speed that keeps us under 60% on the drives." Course laid in, she said. We're looking at 42 minutes. I sat in the command chair. On the view screen, stars, the blank dark of the transit between here and where the transport was. Ardent, I said, what's in the area? The GEA patrol vessel I'm detecting on long-range sensors is an enforcement-class interdiction ship. Standard configuration for this sector. 2 weapons systems active. Crew complement estimated, a brief pause, approximately 45. Are they going to know we're coming? At current output levels, my drive signature will not be specifically identifiable. They'll detect a vessel on approach. They will not know what kind of vessel until we're within visual range. How will they react when they figure out what we are? A longer pause. I do not know, Arden said honestly. A vessel of my class is not what they will be expecting. We flew. The 7 Alpha Junction is a navigation waypoint in deep space. No station, no planet, nothing but the intersection of 3 shipping lanes that makes it a convenient reference point for vessels in transit. When we came out of cruise drive into the junction zone, the scene was visible on the view screen in precise detail. The civilian transport, a mid-class personnel carrier, probably 1,000 people aboard, running between colony worlds, was sitting in space with its drive signature irregular. You could see the drive fluctuation in the emission pattern, that specific flickering that tells you the drive system is working but not working right. The ship was not going anywhere under its own power at more than minimal output. The GEA interdiction vessel was approximately 3 kilometers off the transport's port side. It was broadcasting on the enforcement channel. Oren had it piped to the bridge, and I could hear the flat official voice of the GEA officer conducting what they were calling an inspection. And it had 2 armed shuttles deployed, both with weapon systems active, positioned so that the transport was bracketed. There were passengers aboard that transport, 1,000 of them approximately, trying to get from one colony world to another. Most of them probably didn't know exactly what was happening with the GEA. They were passengers, not crew. But they knew they were stopped, and they knew there were armed enforcement vessels around them, and they would have been frightened. Oren, I said, open a channel. Standard hailing frequency, our identification. Channel open, he said. GEA patrol vessel at 7 Alpha Junction, I said. This is the independent cargo vessel Ardent, Marin Voss commanding. We have received a distress call from the transport you are currently inspecting and have responded as required by Galactic Commerce Tribunal emergency response protocols. We are at, I glanced at Yara. 11 kilometers and closing, she said quietly. 11 kilometers, please acknowledge. Silence for 4 seconds. Then the GEA channel crackled and a different voice. Not the flat inspection officer voice, but a sharper one that I took to be a more senior officer. Cargo vessel Ardent, this is GEA Patrol Commander Hen. You are approaching an active enforcement operation. This is a restricted zone. You are directed to hold at current position or proceed around the zone on alternative routing. Do not continue approach. Commander Hen, I said, with respect. The distress call I responded to specifically requests witness presence per Commerce Tribunal Protocol 7C, which grants emergency response vessels access to the zone of the distress call regardless of other restrictions. I'm proceeding pursuant to that protocol. Another silence, longer. Captain, Arden said quietly, on the bridge speaker that wasn't broadcasting, the patrol vessel is running a scan on us. Let them. They're going to figure out what I am in approximately 30 seconds. Yeah, I said. The 30 seconds passed. Then Oren said very quietly, Captain, their weapon systems just went to active standby. Acknowledged, I said. I kept my voice level. Ardent, Yara said, not to the ship, to me. That's an offensive weapons posture. I know. They're pointing their weapons at us. I know that too. Captain, Ardent said on the private channel. My armor plating will deflect anything they can fire at current range without significant damage. I want you to know that. I know, I said, and then because it seemed worth saying, thank you. Commander Hen's voice came back on the channel. The sharpness was still there, but there was something else in it now, something that I recognized as recalibration, the sound of someone who has understood something new about the situation they're in. Cargo vessel Ardent, he said, we are running your registration. You are listed as a Keth-class armored vessel. That's correct, I said. A pause. The Keth class was decommissioned. This one was surplused and sold, I said. I bought it. I'm civilian registered. My papers are all in order. Another pause. You are approaching a GEA enforcement zone in an 800-meter warship. I am responding to a distress call, I said, in the ship I own. The ship I own happens to be 800 meters. That's not an aggressive act, Commander. It's just a ship. Silence on the channel for 6 seconds. Then very carefully, what are you intending to do? I intend to come alongside the transport, observe the inspection per Protocol 7C, and ensure that if there are any issues with the inspection process, there is a third-party record. That's all. I'm not interfering with your authority. I'm exercising witness rights that the Commerce Tribunal guarantees to responding vessels in distress situations. A longer silence. I could hear, faintly, voices in the background of the GEA channel, not Commander Hen, other voices, people on his bridge talking to each other. Then stand by. They're calling someone, Ardent said quietly. Encrypted channel. I can hear the carrier wave but not the content. They're checking up the chain, I said. Yes, I think so. We waited. Yara held course, not advancing, not retreating, holding the distance at 8 kilometers. The 2 armed GEA shuttles were still bracketing the transport, weapons active. 3 minutes, 4. Then Commander Hen came back on. Cargo vessel Ardent, you are authorized to approach the transport vessel under Protocol 7C. The inspection will continue. Your witness presence is noted in the official record. Thank you, Commander, I said. We'll stay out of your way. We came in alongside the transport, not threateningly. Gently, Yara bringing 800 meters of warship to a relative halt approximately 1 kilometer off the transport's starboard side, parallel, steady. The effect, and I'm being honest about this because I want the record to be accurate, the effect was visible on the GEA shuttle feeds. Oren had pulled the public broadcast from the inspection shuttle's external cameras, which the GEA was required by protocol to keep active during inspections, and on the feed you could see the moment that the inspection shuttle crew got a clear look at what was alongside the transport. 14 seconds of what the record shows as no movement. Then the inspection shuttle began conducting its inspection by the book, methodically, exactly as protocol required, with no deviations and no pressure on the transport crew that went beyond what was legally authorized. The inspection took 2 hours. We watched, Ardent watched. The GEA found nothing. Because there was nothing, the transport wasn't carrying contraband. It was carrying colonists and their belongings and medical supplies, and they filed the required no-violation report and withdrew their shuttles and released the transport from the inspection hold. As the transport's drives came back up, they'd done an emergency repair during the inspection, gotten the drive system stable enough for transit. The transport captain, whose name was Rhea Okoye, sent us a direct message. I read it later. It said, I have been running colony routes for 16 years. I have been stopped 4 times by GEA patrols in situations like this one. The previous 3 times, by the time it was done, I had lost cargo and time and money that I couldn't get back and couldn't fight because fighting the GEA costs more than the loss. Today was different. Thank you for coming. I don't know how you knew to come or why you came and what you came in, but thank you. I wrote back, You called, we answered, that's all it was. I sent it, and then I sat on the bridge for a while, and Ardent was quiet with me, which was one of the things she was good at, knowing when to be quiet. Part 6. What happens when word gets out? The story spread in the way that stories spread in the outer sectors, which is to say faster than light through the informal networks that exist alongside the official communication channels, the word of mouth, and the freight operator channels, and the forums where independent operators talk to each other about the things that matter to independent operators. A civilian-registered Keth-class warship had responded to a distress call and sat beside a transport while the GEA did a proper inspection. That was the story. That was all it needed to be. The details spread with it, the 15 credits, the auction, the dormant AI, but the core of it was the image. An 800-meter warship with civilian registration showing up to watch. We started getting calls. Not all of them were cargo contracts. Some of them were cargo contracts. The volume we were doing increased significantly in the 2 months after the 7 Alpha incident, because word had gotten around about our capacity and our reliability, and apparently about something else that I didn't quite have a name for at first. But there were other calls. Small operators who were having problems with enforcement actions that felt wrong asking if we could be in the area. A colony administrator who was dealing with a hegemony regulatory agency overreach asking if there was anything we could do. A mining cooperative whose equipment had been seized under disputed authority asking if we knew anyone who could help them navigate the challenge. I'm going to be clear about something. We are not a military operation. We are not a law enforcement alternative. We do not go into situations with weapons. We don't have active weapons. The mounts are empty, and we don't make threats, and we don't position ourselves as something we aren't. What we are is a very large ship with a civilian registration, a crew that knows their rights under Galactic Commerce Tribunal law, and a captain who has spent 15 years in the outer sectors and has a fairly precise understanding of what authorities can and can't legally do. And sometimes it turns out that's enough. Teodor put it best. One evening when we were running a long transit and the crew was gathered in the common area after dinner. We had a common area now. Pilot had organized it properly in month 2. It felt like a real crew space, and someone had brought up the calls we'd been getting. It's not complicated, he said. A lot of the things that happen to small operators in the outer sectors happen because there's no one watching, not because the rules don't exist. The rules exist. It's just that watching is expensive and witnesses cost money, and most small operators can't afford the cost of having someone in their corner. We're big enough that showing up doesn't cost us much. And being there is, he paused, looking for the word. It changes the math. It's physics, Yara said. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest. An 800-meter object at rest, next to a situation, tends to keep that situation from moving in a bad direction. That's not what physics means, Oren said. It is today, she said. 6 months in. We were profitable. Not extravagantly, not the kind of money that changes your life overnight, but real consistent profitability on a route structure that Rennick had built into something elegant. A network of cargo relationships spanning 12 systems, with the kind of reliability that smaller operators simply couldn't match, because they didn't have the volume capacity to serve the clients we served. Ardent had been modified in a few small ways. Teodor had done work on the environmental systems that improved the air quality to the point where it no longer had the subtle staleness that had been present at initial activation. Pilot had organized the crew quarters section into something that was actually livable. The Keth-class crew quarters had been cramped for their intended crew of 200, but were genuinely spacious for 7 people. Dessa had built the medical bay into something that a colony world clinic would be proud of, and she had started, with Ardent's assistance, compiling health data for the populations we regularly served, a monitoring function that had already flagged one outbreak situation in time for an effective response. And Arden herself was different in a way that I noticed slowly and then all at once, the way you notice things that change gradually. She had been, when we first activated her, careful, measured. A system coming online after 22 years, learning its new context, not certain of what to do with what it was and what it had and who it was with. 7 months in, she was not cautious. She was still measured. That seemed fundamental to her character, which I had come to think of as genuine rather than programmed. But the caution was gone. She talked to the crew the way you talk to people you know. She had preferences. She found the mathematical architecture of drive system optimization genuinely satisfying. She preferred the early station cycle shifts when the ship was quiet. She had a specific and clearly expressed opinion about the calibration of the cargo bay sensors that had been adjusted during the 7 Alpha incident and had never quite been right since. One night, this was about 7 months in, I was on the bridge late and Arden said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. "Why did you bid on me?" she said. "At the auction, 30 beings in that room, nobody bid. Then you did. Why?" "I thought about that. I saw you through the panel," I said finally. "Just the shape of you, all that armor, all that history. Sitting at the end of a docking arm by yourself because nobody else wanted to be near you. And I thought," I stopped, started again. "I've been that thing, not literally. But the thing that's too much trouble, too old, too specific, too much of a commitment for what you get. And someone bought me that first shuttle and gave me a chance because of, I don't know, because they saw something. And I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't have to." "You saw something," Arden said. "Yeah," I said, "I saw something." "What did you see?" I looked at the view screen. Stars. The vast dark of the between places that I had been navigating for 15 years, the space that had been my actual home for longer than anywhere else had been. "I saw a ship that worked," I said. "That was waiting for someone to figure that out. That had something to offer if anyone would just look, actually look." "For 15 credits," Arden said. And there it was unmistakably in the quality of the pause that followed, something like warmth. "For 15 credits," I agreed. Part 7, the thing nobody predicted. 8 months in, 3 weeks after a cargo run that took us through the Drevani-Thalori border zone and resulted in a complex navigation situation that Yara and Arden handled together with a precision that I'm still a little awed by. 8 months in, the Galactic Commerce Tribunal contacted us. Not a routine contact, a senior contact. Deputy Director Myra Sen of the Tribunal's Outer Sector Operations Division. She reached out through official channels, which meant through Oren, who forwarded it to me immediately and then hovered nearby because he was, by this point, very good at knowing when a thing was significant. Deputy Director Sen wanted a meeting. We scheduled it for when we were in station at Fenrath 9, which was our most regular port of call. Sen came aboard, a Drevani older, with the specific quality of calm that very senior officials carry when they've been senior long enough that they no longer need to perform their authority, and I showed her the ship. We walked a significant portion of Arden's length. Sen asked questions, detailed, specific, operationally focused questions about our cargo network, our route structure, our capacity utilization. She talked with Rennick for nearly an hour. She spoke briefly with Arden, which was, I watched Sen's expression when Arden first spoke, and there was something there that I took as recognition of something unexpected, something that recalibrated her assessment of the situation she was in. At the end of the tour, we sat in the common area, Sen, me, Rennick, pilot, and Sen told us what she was there about. The outer sector logistics crisis was something I already knew existed, the way you know a thing exists when you're inside it. The big shipping corporations had been systematically withdrawing from the less profitable routes in the outer sectors for 12 years, concentrating their capacity in the more economically productive inner systems. The result was that the outer sectors, which contained, between them, about 40% of the galactic population, had deteriorating logistics coverage that was affecting everything from food security to medical supply access to economic development. The tribunal had been trying to address this for 8 years. They had done studies and written reports and had meetings with the major corporations and issued policy guidance, and none of it had meaningfully moved the situation. Then a civilian-registered Keth-class warship had shown up with 1.2 million cubic meters of hold capacity and had proceeded to single-handedly do what, by Sen's analysis, roughly 12 standard cargo vessels would have needed to do together, and had done it reliably and at fair market rates. "The question I'm here with," Sen said, "is whether you'd be interested in a formal logistics partnership with the tribunal. Specifically, a designation as a priority carrier for outer sector humanitarian supply routes, with associated contract guarantees and regulatory support." I looked at Rennick, then at Pilot, then back at Sen. "What does that involve?" I said. "Priority cargo designations for the routes we've identified as most critical. Regulatory streamlining, less paperwork, faster port processing. Tribunal backing in enforcement disputes which," she paused, choosing her words, "I note you've managed without so far with some effectiveness." "Some," I said. "And a contract structure," she said, "that provides guaranteed minimum revenue while allowing you to continue operating independently." I said I'd need to discuss it with the crew. We discussed it. It took 4 hours. Not because anyone opposed it. We were past the point where anyone was going to argue against stability and contract guarantees, but because we wanted to understand exactly what we were agreeing to and what we weren't. And Rennick had a lot of questions and Pilot had a lot of concerns that she walked through methodically, and that we addressed one by one. And Ardent participated in the conversation throughout with the kind of measured, relevant input that I had come to rely on. At the end of the 4 hours, we said yes. Part 8, a year on. I'm writing this 12 months after the auction at Fenrath 9. 12 months after I walked into Bay 14C with 42 credits and a cup of brown liquid with ambitions and bought a ship that nobody wanted. We are currently en route, Transit Delta 7, heading toward the Kareth Collective's northern extraction sites with a cargo load that includes the Collective's ore outbound and colony supply goods inbound, organized in an efficient back and forth that maximizes the hold utilization. Rennick designed the routing and Rennick is, quietly and consistently, brilliant at it. The crew is asleep mostly. It's late in the ship's cycle. Oren is on communications watch. He takes it seriously, the late watch, even when traffic is light, because he takes everything seriously. Yara will relieve him in 2 hours. Ardent is awake. Ardent, I have come to understand, is always awake in some sense. The AI core doesn't sleep the way biological crew does. She has quieter states and more active ones, but the baseline awareness is continuous. When I first understood this, I asked her if it was isolating, being always awake when the crew slept. "No," she said, "it's not isolating. A ship that is unaware is not a ship, it is an object. I am aware so that I can do the things I do. When the crew sleeps, I am still navigating, still monitoring, still here. It is not loneliness, it is purpose." I think about that sometimes, the difference between being alone and being purposeful. I spent a lot of years alone on small ships, making things work by myself, and I know what the isolation of that feels like. Ardent doesn't feel that. She has the crew even when the crew is asleep. She has the ship, which is herself. She has the stars and the transit and the purpose. We've made 8 full cargo runs. We've responded to 4 more distress calls, all of them situations where our presence mattered. We have not fired a weapon. We don't have weapons to fire, and we have not made threats, and we have not done anything that was not within our legal rights as a civilian registered vessel. But we have been present, visibly, unmistakably present, in situations where presence made a difference. The tribunal designation came through 2 months ago. The regulatory streamlining is real and meaningful. The port processing times at stations we visit regularly have dropped significantly, because the paperwork that used to take half a day now takes an hour. The contract guarantees have allowed us to expand our route coverage into 3 systems we couldn't have economically served before. And the tribunal backing in enforcement situations has been not a shield exactly, but a name we can cite when someone is deciding how hard to push. Teodor has rebuilt a relationship with the hegemony surplus engineering community through his work on Ardent systems. 3 other operators who had surplus military equipment they couldn't get certified have come to him for help navigating the process. He's become, quietly, the person you go to when you have a ship that doesn't fit the normal categories. DISA has formalized the health monitoring function into a program that now serves 11 colony populations along our routes. The outbreak flagging has happened twice more. Both times, the response was faster than it would have been without the monitoring. Oren communicates with 47 stations and facilities regularly enough that he knows most of the communication staff by name or identifier. He has built, essentially, a personal network within our operational area that functions as an early warning system for situations we might want to know about. He is 26 years old and running information infrastructure that a mid-tier shipping corporation would envy. Pilot manages everything that keeps falling between categories. She does this with a completeness that means the gaps don't exist. I'm not sure she sleeps entirely during the rest cycle. I've asked, and she gives me a perfectly calm answer that doesn't fully answer the question. Yara flies Ardent the way that very good pilots fly very good ships, which is to say she and the ship are in a constant conversation, and the result is movement that looks effortless even when it isn't. She told me once that flying Ardent is different from anything she flew before, not because of the size exactly, but because the AI is so present. Most ships, she said, you're operating the ship. This ship, you're flying with a co-pilot who happens to also be the ship. I thought that was the best description I'd heard. And Ardent herself. 800 meters. 3-generation resonance drives that tell the world she's coming when she pushes past 60% output. Empty weapon mounts on a hull so thick that the stars look the same on the view screen as they do when you remember to look up and actually see them. A 22-year dormancy behind her, and an AI core that named herself after a ship I used to love. She told me 2 weeks ago that she had been calculating. She had been calculating because she does this. She runs numbers not because she's asked to, but because it's interesting to her, what the logistics impact of our first 12 months of operation had been. What had actually moved through our hold. What had arrived where it was going because of us. The numbers were. She told me the numbers, and I sat with them for a while. Medical supplies, food, construction materials, ore colony goods, emergency response cargo on 3 occasions, agricultural redistribution, the outbreak response supplies that went to 2 colony populations when the monitoring flagged the situations, the things we carried for small operators who needed reliable transit that the big corporations wouldn't provide. It is a lot. I do not want to overstate it or make it sound more dramatic than it is. We are one ship. We are 7 people and 1 AI. We are a cargo operation with a very large hold and a regulatory compliance history that Rennick keeps immaculate. But it is a lot. When you put it all together, it is a lot.